And hello, young lovers, wherever you are. And hello, my wild darlings, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are currently hanging out. I am hanging out, as usual, in California, and that is not very surprising because that is where I live and where my office is still my New Year's resolution. But I'm going to get to it. I swear I will. And what else do I have to say? Well, Christmas has come and gone. I cannot say I am sad to see it in the rearview mirror because for me it is always a highly stressful time of the year. My wife Deborah's birthday is right before Christmas. I have to do a metric ton of shopping and wrapping and all that stuff. However, it's worth it, of course. It's worth it for Deborah. It's worth it for Christmas. But when it gets to this time of the year, it just seems, for essentially a hermit like me, it just seems like a never-ending carousel of stuff that has to be done and people that have to be seen. People I love. Don't get me wrong. The people I love. I'm very lucky to have friends and family. But I don't know. I use the word hermetic. I certainly feel more that way now than I did when I was younger. And also just me being me, I've always got things that I mean to do, that I need to do, that I always feel like I'm behind on. Of course, this is largely illusory. I will fill you in on something you probably already know. It took me years to figure it out. I remember being in London in the 1990s when I first moved in with Deborah, and we have had our 30th anniversary now, so that gives you an idea of how long ago that was. But anyway, so I was sitting there one day thinking, if I only get this done and finish this book, I am totally caught up. And after a moment of thinking that, I said, who am I kidding? I've been telling myself that since I graduated from high school. I'll never be caught up because there is no such thing because, of course, life keeps happening. It's a caucus race. For those of you who, especially my European friends, may not be as familiar with that term, caucus race. It's from Alice in Wonderland. I believe it's Alice in Wonderland and not Through the Looking Glass, but it's definitely an Alice and a Lewis Carroll thing. And it's the one, the caucus race is what she gets dragged into. Alice, who of course is constantly dealing with the illogic of Wonderland, the Wonderland, whatever it is. And she gets dragged into a race, and what a caucus race is, and it's spelled like a political caucus, C-A-U-C-U-S, but what a caucus race actually is you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in one place. So somewhere back in 1995, I realized that I was in a caucus race with life, and that I would have to continue running as fast as I could. Not only would I not catch up, but that if I slowed down, I would get farther and farther behind. Now, the main thing that's changed as I've gotten older is that I've realized that not only will I never be caught up, it doesn't even really matter that much if I fall farther behind. Because it's like if you're already the elephant man and somebody tells you, well, if you don't eat your greens and if you don't take your vitamins, you're going to get uglier. Well, if you're already the elephant man, that's really not much of a threat. Similarly, if I get farther behind, nobody's going to know but me because I've already, sloughed off so many things because of, not having the time to do them all. So that's my major revelation. So I actually am, however, going to get the office dealt with very soon. Part of it is I need better weather because things have to be hauled in and out and stuff like that. And it's not something that's fun to do in the rain. Let me think. Anything else I want to talk about? Still working on Splintered Sun, having some issues, having some struggles just with structure. I realized I sailed into this very blithely. Because I was going, well, it's just Ostenard. Yeah, it's a couple of hundred years before the Dragonbone chair, but it's still just Ostenard. And then I realized partway into it, okay, it's Ostenard, but it is different. It is earlier, and yet there are enough historical references in the other books that I have to make them consistent with that. And that's not such a problem. I mean, obviously, I've done that before. But also, I realized, I'm making up an entire new group of characters from scratch, and I have to figure out how to tell the story while not venturing into 4-book trilogy territory, or not even 3-book trilogy territory, because I really want this to be done in a single, fairly decent sized volume. And then if people enjoy it, I'll write some more, because that's the intention with this, is that these will be separate stories. Anyway, so that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'm having various structural thoughts, which are actually kind of interesting from a writer's point of view, since, I've just spent 10 years working on something which, after the first few years, largely, God, it's scary to talk about a project you're working on and talk about after the first few years. That's terrifying. Especially, as I see the future getting shorter in front of me. But it is true that after the first few years, one of these big, long, multi-volume stories kind of tells itself, not in the sense that there's no work involved. Of course, there's a ton of work involved and lots of decisions to be made, et cetera, et cetera. But most of it is laid into place, and you mostly just have to follow the plot lines forward and gradually weave them together, which of course is complicated. I mean, that's why not everybody in this business finishes their long stories in any kind of decent time. But it's not in and of itself that difficult, and I've done it already several times, obviously. I've written many multi-volume stories. But with this particular thing with A Splintered Sun, I'm trying to do it in a shorter space. But I realized very early on I couldn't tell the story properly with just one focal point character like I could with the Bobby Dollar books, and it wasn't set up in such a way to tell the story with one focal point character as with Brothers of the Wind. So I'm now struggling with, well, how many characters am I going to need? Do I have enough? Is it going to diffuse the attention? All these kind of, writerly worries. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. And I'm frustrated, but it's not a bad frustration. It's the frustration of trying to make something work. And if what you do as your vocation or avocation is try to make complicated things work, it's actually kind of stimulating to the brain. But it can also be frustrating as well, as anybody who's tried to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture while someone else is watching and making comments knows. It can be a bit complicated at times. So I'm enjoying it, but it's also driving me mad. What else is there to say? Well, there's a minor cat riot going on in the background tonight, but they seem to have finally calmed down a little bit, so that won't be anything that should distract anybody. Deborah, my wonderful wife, is upstairs asleep, as she always is at this time of the night, because she is a morning person. I just saw something go past on YouTube about you may have the Neanderthals to thank for you being a morning person, in which case I'm going to have to go and watch that and find out what the source material is, since Deb and I are both fascinated by anthropology, among other things, and human descent in particular, and because we're in the golden age of anthropology right now. I mean, every time we turn around, there is a new human ancestor or human-like ancestor, hominin ancestor. So, and if it's really true that Deborah is a morning person because of Neanderthal DNA, that will be very interesting. I don't know who's to blame for me and my late night habits, other than probably somebody in my own family in the last couple of generations who was probably part owl or something. Anyway, what else? So cats are okay, dogs are okay, house is okay, the water is off again. We're having horrible problems with our well, but I won't bore you with that because it's really boring, and it just, at the moment, it just means every few hours I have to go out and try to get the well started up again, because we are not on public water. We are in the hills, and there are some things about living in the hills that are definitely different. One of them is that your mailbox is usually far away from your house, so we're having a lot of mail issues at the moment. People keep trying to break into our mailboxes. When I say our, I don't mean Deb and I have more than one. I mean we have neighbors, and all of our mailboxes are down at the bottom of the hill. it's sometimes hard to get people to come up and make the deliveries. There are no sidewalks, of course. That's one of the things about living in a rural area, is that for some reason the people who live in rural areas never have sidewalks. I guess because most of the roads are private roads, and nobody wants to put out the money for a sidewalk. And in the rich parts of rural areas, they don't want sidewalks because they don't want people coming in, and they don't want people hanging around. Undesirable folk. If they only knew. I've lived across the street or nearby to so many really rich people in my adult life. None of them knew that they were actually harboring exactly the kind of persons they wanted to keep away. It's just that those persons had been able to buy into the neighborhoods, although usually in much smaller houses. Just a brief aside here, we actually lived across the street from California's Governor Gavin Newsom is married to a woman whose parents were extremely wealthy software people, and we lived across the street. We lived in a fairly ordinary house. Some of the people who listen to these readings have been to that house, our old house, and it's a perfectly nice house. There's nothing wrong with it, and it was decent size and all that. But literally across the street from us, there was a giant compound, and when I say compound, I am using the word with full knowledge. I mean, there were like 8 houses. It was all one family, but they had like 8 different buildings in there. And at night there were private security guards driving around with like German shepherds in the car with them, big old police dogs and spotlights and all this stuff. So it was a strange experience living across the street from that kind of, American wealth. And we were meanwhile living our pretty normal life. I never got used to it. And so anyway, I don't know why I'm off on that tangent. Oh, I was just talking about the fact that, so we have a well. We don't get our water pumped to us by the county or anything like that. And for some reason, our well is messed up. And especially when it's been raining, so it probably has something to do with how it's reading how much water it needs in the system or something. It keeps shutting off, and I have to keep going out there all the time, walk down the property and take a pair of pliers or a wrench with me and try and turn it back on again. So I'm getting pretty sick and tired of that. Anyway, not to complain. My woes are small compared to many people out there in the world, so don't mean to complain. That's just what I've been doing a lot of lately. I've been going out to turn the well on 5, 6, 7 times a day. And it's, mostly only an issue when you go to the sink and you turn the faucet on to like wash something off your hands and nothing comes out. Or you're just about to get into the shower and you just finished shaving and you're covered in bits of lather and stuff and all that. And you take all your clothes off and you get into the shower, and between the time you were shaving and the time you tried to turn the shower on, the well stopped working again. So it's life. What can I say? I'm sure there are many people out there dealing with far worse things every day on a much more regular basis than anything I have to worry about. Okay, so I'm going to check in really quickly and see who has shown up to say hello. And who we got here? Those are the captions. Those are... Okay, and as usual, they don't give me what I want. Why do these things happen and then not happen again? I don't understand. I really don't. Anyway, okay, so I can only see like 4 or 5 comments at this point, and I know there's more than that going on, but for some reason, this is all I've got. So I see Isaac is here, and I see Mark, and Isaac says, grew up rural, but nowhere near rich people. Well, Senator Mike Lee tried to buy the small town I grew up in. Yeah, rich people do things like that. I remember Kim Basinger, the actress, bought an entire small town in Texas or somewhere. I don't know whatever happened with that. Mark checks in. Mark Redmond says it's nice and sunny in his part of Yorkshire. Suzanne checked in, and the murk has lifted in her part of Yorkshire. So Mark and Suzanne, I'm glad you're having a nice Yorkshire morning. And James checks in and says hello to his friends. And again, I have no idea why the rest of everything is not available. but for some reason it is not. Oh, there's more. Okay. So Petra, hello Petra, good to see you. And nope, that was the only other one I've got. So anyway, well, whoever else is here, nice to have you. Thank you for joining me. I have not the slightest idea why it's doing the things it's doing. So I am still reading. I am reading from the Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. Got a couple of short sections to start tonight, and then why have I got two? Oh, I see. Okay. I'm reading from Martian Chronicles. Got a couple of short things to start tonight and then a story. And I may finish it early and have to decide whether to start the next story, which is one of my favorites. And it's one of the ones that I always think of first when I think of the Martian Chronicles, because it's kind of Ray Bradbury's crusade against the anti-fun brigade. But that's not the first story we're reading. The first story we're reading comes after the two short things, and is kind of interesting. It's one I didn't remember. I didn't remember this. I'm not sure, 100% sure that it was in the copy that I first read of the Martian Chronicles, which is interesting to think, but I may just have spaced it. So anyway, I am going to start reading. I have nothing else useful to say. That's usually the case, but tonight is even more so. So here we go. Thanks for being with me. February 2034. Interim. They brought in 15,000 lumber feet of Oregon pine to build 10th City, and 79,000 feet of California redwood, and they hammered together a clean, neat little town by the edge of the stone canals. On Sunday nights, you could see red, blue, and green stained glass light in the churches, and hear the voices singing the numbered hymns. We will now sing 79. We will now sing 94. And in certain houses, you heard the hard clatter of a typewriter, the novelist at work, or the scratch of a pen, the poet at work, or no sound at all, the former beachcomber at work. It was as if, in many ways, a great earthquake had shaken loose the roots and cellars of an Iowa town, and then, in an instant, a whirlwind twister of Oz-like proportions had carried the entire town off to Mars to set it down without a bump. So, just a couple of interesting things to notice here. Bradbury, most of these stories, or many of them, I think, if not all of them, were originally published in the 1950s. So what you see is Bradbury both kind of straddling the science fiction future and even in the 1950s, a kind of a longing for the earlier America of his boyhood. The thing that all of us have sentimental feelings about, the time that we grew up, the place that we grew up. Some of them are negative sentiments for some people, obviously, if you grew up in an unpleasant place or with unpleasant surroundings or environment in general or whatever it might be. But Bradbury is very nostalgic, and it's a big part of his work, and it comes through. We'll see it in other places, and we've seen it in several places so far. But it is interesting. So on the one hand, he's talking about 2034, which is 80 years in the future. It's 10 years in the future from us, even. It was excuse me. It was probably 80 years at least from when Bradbury wrote it. And yet, unlike other science fiction writers of his era, Bradbury is not worrying about the technical stuff particularly, and the fact that he talks about a typewriter. I think even in the 1950s, most people understood that there were probably going to be advances beyond the typewriter by the time 80 years had passed. And certainly in writers writing not much later than that, you see it all the time. But again, this is one of the things about Bradbury that always interested me, is his science fiction is not about science. It's a staging area. It is literally a stage on which these ideas that he's playing with can be brought out and be talked about, because of course Bradbury is great with language. And so the fact of what people are actually using to type on in the year 2034 on Mars, and the fact that they're all Americans, which he did actually explain that in his version only Americans could afford to put together the rocket programs to get to Mars. But it's a really interesting combination of factors where he's really taking his earlier childhood in the 1910s and 20s and putting it forward 100 years onto Mars in some shape or form, because that's what matters to him. And that is where both the positive and the negative side come into play, as we saw with all the people who thought the earlier Mars mission, who thought that they had found a town from their childhood on Mars and were drawn off into all these houses by all these relatives who had passed away but were miraculously alive on Mars. And of course it turned out to be a horrible, horrible trick, and they were all killed by those same Martians pretending to be those same relatives. So there's a very interesting ambivalence, I think, involved here about nostalgia, and the idea that you love this stuff because it's yours, it's magic for you, and it definitely is. It's all magic for all of us, these things that bring up ideas of how the world was before we questioned it. When it was just the place we lived in, and before we began to understand the complexity of it, namely when we were children. And he's pointing out that also that nostalgia has a dark side, a shadowy side, that it can fool you, that it can cause you to think things like, oh, I'm going to vote for the guy who says he's going to make things the way they used to be, just to offer an example. So anyway, interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? An interesting ambivalence about nostalgia that is there, even if Bradbury himself wasn't always conscious of it. April 2034, The Musicians. The boys would hike far out into the Martian country. They carried odorous paper bags into which from time to time upon the long walk they would insert their noses to inhale the rich smell of the ham and mayonnaised pickles, and to listen to the liquid gurgle of the orange soda in the warming bottles. Swinging their grocery bags full of clean, watery green onions and odorous liverwurst and red ketchup and white bread, they would dare each other on past the limits set by their stern mothers. They would run, yelling, "First one there gets to kick!" They hiked in summer, autumn, or winter. Autumn was most fun, because then they imagined, like on Earth, they were scuttering through autumn leaves. They would come like a scatter of jackstones on the marble flats beside the canals, the candy-cheeked boys with blue agate eyes, panting onion-tainted commands to each other. For now that they had reached the dead forbidden town, it was no longer a matter of, "Last one there's a girl," or "First one gets to play musician." Now the dead town's doors lay wide, and they thought they could hear the faintest crackle, like autumn leaves, from inside. They would hush themselves forward by each other's elbows, carrying sticks, remembering their parents had told them, "Not there. No to none of the old towns. Watch where you hike. You'll get the beating of your life when you come home. We'll check your shoes." And there they stood in the dead city, a heap of boys, their hiking lunches half devoured, daring each other in shrieky whispers. "Here goes nothing!" And suddenly one of them took off into the nearest stone house, through the door, across the living room, and into the bedroom, where, without half looking, he would kick about, thrash his feet, and the black leaves would fly through the air, brittle, thin as tissue cut from midnight sky. Behind him would race 6 others, and the first boy there would be the musician, playing the white xylophone bones beneath the outer covering of black flakes. A great skull would roll to view like a snowball, they shouted. Ribs like spider legs, plangent as a dull harp, and then the black flakes of mortality blowing all about them in their scuffling dance. The boys pushed and heaved and fell in the leaves, in the death that had turned the dead to flakes and dryness, into a game played by boys whose stomachs gurgled with orange pop. And then, out of one house into another, into 17 houses, mindful that each of the towns in its turn was being burned clean of its horrors by the firemen, antiseptic warriors with shovels and bins, shoveling away at the ebony tatters and peppermint stick bones, slowly but assuredly separating the terrible from the normal. So they must play very hard, these boys. The firemen would soon be here. Then, luminous with sweat, they gnashed at their last sandwiches. With a final kick, a final marimba concert, a final autumnal lunge through leaf stacks, they went home. Their mothers examined their shoes for black flakelets, which, when discovered, resulted in scalding baths and fatherly beatings. By the year's end, the firemen had raked the autumn leaves and white xylophones away, and it was no more fun. May 2034, the wilderness. Oh, by the way, just to carry on that thought from what I'd been talking about before the previous snippet. Interestingly, again, because of what Bradbury, this dichotomy of what Bradbury was working with there, you see that basically it's a transplant of his own childhood. Because, I'm sorry, they're not, they've made it clear that the rockets, this is me being science fiction brain, they've made it clear that the rockets are just bringing as many people as they can, et cetera, but they've got orange pop on Mars. They got orange soda on Mars and liverwurst and all kinds of things. Now, liverwurst they might be able to make in the first few months after they get to Mars, but I'm not too sure about bottles of orange pop. But again, it doesn't matter. It's not the science that matters here. It's Bradbury juxtaposing, probably in a sense, not just the specifics of the Mars thing, but this is a guy who grew up in Illinois in the early part of the 20th century, and they were probably playing on, the idea of cowboys and Indians, and they were dealing with, the idea of the Indians who had once lived there, the Native Americans, who are all now dead and gone, which is why we have so many things about Indian graveyards and stuff in fiction, in American fiction, American fantasy, and horror fiction. Anyway, May 2034, the wilderness. Oh, the good time has come at last. It was twilight, and Janice and Lenora packed steadily in their summer house, singing songs, eating little, and holding to each other when necessary. But they never glanced at the window, where the night gathered deep and the stars came out bright and cold. "Listen," said Janice. A sound like a steamboat down the river, but it was a rocket in the sky, and beyond that, banjos playing? No, only the summer night crickets in this year 2034. 10,000 sounds breathed through the town and the weather. Janice, head bent, listened. Long, long ago, 1849, this very street had breathed the voices of ventriloquists, preachers, fortune-tellers, fools, scholars, gamblers, gathered at this self-same Independence, Missouri, waiting for the moist earth to bake and the great tidal grasses to come up heavy enough to hold the weight of their carts, their wagons, their indiscriminate destinies, and their dreams. Oh, the good time has come at last. To Mars we are a-going, sir. 5,000 women in the sky. That's quite a springtime sowing, sir. That's an old Wyoming song, said Lenora. Change the words and it's fine for 2034. Janice lifted a matchbox of food pills, calculating the totals of things carried in those high-axled, tall-bedded wagons. For each man, each woman, incredible tonnages. Hams, bacon slabs, sugar, salt, flour, dried fruits, pilot bread, citric acid, water, ginger, pepper, a list as big as the land. Yet here, today, pills that fit a wristwatch fed you not from Fort Laramie to Hangtown, but all across a wilderness of stars. Janice threw wide the closet door and almost screamed. Darkness and night and all the spaces between the stars looked out at her. Long years ago, two things had happened. Her sister had locked her, shrieking, in a closet. And, at a party, playing hide and seek, she had run through the kitchen and into a long, dark hall. But It wasn't a hall. It was an unlit stairwell, a swallowing blackness. She had run out upon empty air. She had pedaled, her feet screamed and fallen in midnight blackness into the cellar. It took a long while, a heartbeat, to fall. And she had smothered in that closet a long, long time without daylight, without friends, no one to hear her screaming. Away from everything, locked in darkness, falling in darkness, shrieking. The two memories. Now, with the closet door wide, with darkness like a velvet shroud hung before her to be stroked by a trembling hand, with the darkness like a black panther breathing there, looking at her with unlit eyes, the two memories rushed out. Space and a falling. Space and being locked away, screaming. She and Lenora working steadily, packing, being careful not to glance out the window at the frightening Milky Way and the vast emptiness, only to have the long familiar closet with its private night remind them at last of their destiny. This was how it would be, out there, sliding toward the stars in the night, in the great hideous black closet, screaming, but no one to hear, falling forever among meteor clouds and godless comets, down the elevator shaft, down the nightmare coal chute into nothingness. She screamed. None of it came out of her mouth. It collided upon itself in her chest and head. She screamed. She slammed the closet door. She lay against it. She felt the darkness breathe and yammer at the door, and she held it tight, eyes watering. She stood there a long time until the trembling vanished, watching Lenora work, and the hysteria, thus ignored, drained away, and at last was gone. A wristwatch ticked, with a clean sound of normality in the room. 60 million miles. She moved at last to the window as if it were a deep well. I can't believe that men on Mars tonight are building towns, waiting for us. The only thing to believe is catching our rocket tomorrow. Janice raised a white gown like a ghost in the room. Strange, strange, to marry on another world. Let's go to bed. No, the call comes at midnight. I couldn't sleep thinking how to tell Will I've decided to take the Mars rocket. Oh, Lenora, think of it. My voice traveling 60 million miles on the light phone to him. I changed my mind so quick. I'm scared. Our last night on Earth. Now they really knew and accepted it. Now the knowledge had found them out. They were going away, and they might never come back. They were leaving the town of Independence in the state of Missouri, on the continent of North America, surrounded by one ocean, which was the Atlantic, and another the Pacific, none of which could be put in their traveling cases. They had shrunk from this final knowledge. Now it was facing them, and they were struck numb. Our children won't be Americans or Earth people at all. We'll all be Martians the rest of our lives. I don't want to go, cried Janice suddenly. The panic rose in her with ice and fire. I'm afraid. The space, the darkness, the rocket, the meteors, everything gone. Why should I go out there? Lenora took hold of her shoulders and held her close, rocking her. It's a new world. It's like the old days. The men first and the women following. Why? Why should I go? Tell me. Because, said Lenora at last quietly, seating her on the bed, Will is up there. His name was good to hear. Janice quieted. These men make it so hard, said Lenora. Used to be if a woman ran 200 miles after a man, it was something. Then they made it 1,000 miles. Now they put a whole universe between us. But that can't stop us, can it? I'm afraid I'll be a fool on the rocket. I'll be a fool with you. Lenora got up. Now, let's walk around town. Let's see everything one last time. Janice stared out at the town. Tomorrow night this'll all be here, but we won't. People will wake up, eat, work, sleep, wake again, but we won't know it, and they'll never miss us. Lenora and Janice moved around each other as if they couldn't find the door. Come on. They opened the door, switched off the lights, stepped out, and shut the door behind them. In the sky, there was a great coming in and coming in. Fast, flowering motions, huge whistlings and whirlings, snowstorms falling. Helicopters, white flakes dropping quietly. From west and east and north and south, the women were arriving, their hearts neatly tissue papered in their suitcases. Through all of the night sky, you saw helicopters blizzard down. The hotels were full. Private homes were making accommodations. Tent cities rose in meadows and pastures like strange, ugly flowers, and the town and the country were warm with more than summer tonight. Warm with women's pink faces and the sunburnt faces of new men watching the sky. Beyond the hills, rockets tried their fire, and a sound like a giant organ pressed upon all its keys at once, shuddered every crystal window and every hidden bone. You felt it in your jaw, your toes, your fingers, a shivering. Lenora and Janice sat in the drugstore among strange women. You ladies look pretty, but you sure look sad, said the soda fountain man. 2 chocolate malteds. Lenora smiled for both of them, as if Janice were mute. They gazed at the chocolate drink as if it was a rare museum painting. Malts would be scarce for many years on Mars. Janice fussed in her purse and took out an envelope, reluctantly, and laid it on the marble counter. This is from Will, to me. It came in the rocket mail 2 days ago. It was this that made up my mind for me, made me decide to go. I didn't tell you. I want you to see it now. Go ahead, read the note. Lenora shook the note out of the envelope and read it aloud. Dear Janice, this is our house if you decide to come to Mars. Will. Lenora tapped the envelope again, and a color photograph dropped out, glistening on the counter. It was a picture of a house, a dark, mossy, ancient, caramel brown, comfortable house with red flowers and green, cool ferns bordering it, and a disreputably hairy ivy on the porch. But, Janice, what? This is a picture of your house, here on Earth, here on Elm Street. No, look close. And they looked again together, and on both sides of the comfortable dark house and behind it was scenery that was not Earth scenery. The soil was a strange color of violet, and the grass was the faintest bit red, and the sky glowed like a gray diamond, and a strange, crooked tree grew to one side, looking like an old woman with crystals in her white hair. That's the house Will's built for me, said Janice, on Mars. It helps to look at it. All yesterday, when I had the chance, alone, and was most afraid and panicky, I took out this picture and looked at it. They both gazed at the dark, comfortable house 60 million miles away, familiar but unfamiliar, old but new, a yellow light shining in the right front parlor window. That man Will, said Lenora, nodding her head, knows just what he's doing. They finished their drinks. Outside, a vast, warm crowd of strangers wandered by, and the, quote, snow, unquote, fell steadily in the summer sky. They bought many silly things to take with them, bags of lemon candy, glossy women's magazines, fragile perfumes. Let the takeoff weighers worry later what constitutes essential load. And then they walked out into the town and, not minding the expense, rented 2 belted jackets, 2 small machines that refused gravity and imitated the butterfly, and touched the delicate controls and felt themselves whispered like white blossom petals over the town. "Anywhere," said Lenora, "anywhere at all." They let the wind blow them where it would. They let the wind take them through the night of summer apple trees and the night of warm preparation, over the lovely town, over the houses of childhood and other days, over schools and avenues, over creeks and meadows and farms so familiar that each grain of wheat was a golden coin. They blew as leaves must blow before the threat of a fire wind, with warning whispers and summer lightning crackling among the folded hills. They saw the milk-dust country roads where, not so long ago, they had drifted in moonlit helicopters in great whirls of sound, spiraling down to touch beside cool night streams with the young men who were now gone. They floated in an immense sigh above a town already made remote by the little space between themselves and the earth, a town receding behind them in a black river and coming up in a tidal wave of lights and color ahead, untouchable and a dream now, already smeared in their eyes with nostalgia, with the panic of memory that began before the thing was gone. Blown quietly, eddying, they gazed secretly at 100 faces of dear friends they were leaving behind, the lamplit people held and framed by windows which slid by on the wind, it seemed, all of time breathing them along. There was no tree they did not examine for old confessions of love carved and whittled there, no sidewalk they did not skim across as over fields of mica snow. For the first time they knew that their town was beautiful, and the lonely lights and the ancient bricks beautiful, and they both felt their eyes grow large with the beauty of this feast they were giving themselves. All floated upon an evening carousel, with fitful drifts of music wafting up here and there, and voices calling and murmuring from houses that were whitely haunted by television. The two women passed like needles, sewing one tree to the next with their perfume. Their eyes were too full, and yet they kept putting away each detail, each shadow, each solitary oak and elm, each passing car upon the small snaking streets below, until not only their eyes but their heads and then their hearts were too full. "I feel like I'm dead," thought Janice, "and in the graveyard on a spring night, and everything alive but me, and everyone moving and ready to go on with life without me. It's like I felt each spring when I was very young, passing the graveyard and weeping for them because they were dead, and it didn't seem fair on nights as soft as that I was alive. I was guilty of living. And now here, tonight, I feel they have taken me from the graveyard and let me go above the town just once more to see what it is like to be living, to be a town and a people, before they slam the black door on me again." Softly, softly, like two white paper lanterns on a night wind, the women moved over their lifetime and their past, and over the meadows where the tent cities glowed, and the highways where supply trucks would be clustered and running until dawn. They hovered above it all for a long time. The courthouse clock was booming 11:45 when they came, like spider webs floating from the stars, touching on the moonlit pavement before Janice's old house. The city was asleep, and Janice's house waited for them to come in searching for their sleep, which was not there. "Is this us here?" asked Janice. "Janice Smith and Lenora Holmes in the year 2034? "Yes." Janice licked her lips and stood straight. "I wish it was some other year. 1492? 1612? Lenora sighed, and the wind in the trees sighed with her, moving away. "It's always Columbus Day or Plymouth Rock Day, and I'll be darned if I know what we women can do about it." "Be old maids? Or do just what we're doing?" They opened the door of the warm night house, the sounds of the town dying slowly in their ear. As they shut the door, the phone began to ring. "The call!" cried Janice, running. Lenora came into the bedroom after her, and already Janice had the receiver up and was saying, "Hello? Hello?" And the operator in a far city was readying the immense apparatus which would tie two worlds together, and the two women waited, one sitting and pale, the other standing, but just as pale, bent toward her. There was a long pause full of stars and time, a waiting pause not unlike the last 3 years for all of them. And now the moment had arrived, and it was Janice's turn to phone through millions upon millions of miles of meteors and comets, running away from the yellow sun, which might boil or burn her words or scorch the meaning from them. Her voice like a silver needle through everything, in stitches of talking across the big night, reverberating from the moons of Mars and rushing on. And then her voice found its way to a man in a room in a city, there on another world, 5 minutes by radio away. And her message was this: "Hello, Will? This is Janice." She swallowed. "They say I haven't much time. A minute." She closed her eyes. "I want to talk slow, but they say talk fast and get it all in. So I want to say, I've decided. I will come up there. I'll go on the rocket tomorrow. I will come up there to you, after all. And I love you. I hope you can hear me. I love you. It's been so long." Her voice motioned on its way to that unseen world. Now, with her message sent, the words, she wanted to call them back, to censor, to rearrange them, to make a prettier sentence, a fairer explanation of her soul. But already the words were hung between planets, and if by some cosmic radiation they could have been illuminated, caught fire in vaporous wonder there, her love would have lit a dozen worlds and startled the night side of Earth into a premature dawn, she thought. Now the words were not hers at all. They belonged to space. They belonged to no one until they arrived, and they were traveling at 186,000 miles a second to their target. What will he say to me? What will he say back in his minute of time, she wondered. She fussed with and twisted the watch on her wrist, and the light phone receiver on her ear crackled, and space talked to her with electrical jigs and dances and audible auroras. "Has he replied?" whispered Lenora. "Shh," said Janice, bending as if sick. Then the voice came through space from him. "I hear him," cried Janice. "What does he say?" The voice called out from Mars and took itself through the places where there was no sunrise or sunset, but always the night with a sun in the middle of blackness. And somewhere between Mars and Earth, everything of the message was lost, perhaps in a sweep of electrical gravity rushing by on the flood tides of a meteor, or interfered with by a rain of silver meteors. In any event, the small words and the unimportant words of the message were washed away, and his voice came through saying only one word: "Love?" After that, there was the huge night again, and the sound of stars turning and suns whispering to themselves, and the sound of her heart, like another world in space, filling her earphones. "Did you hear him?" asked Lenora. Janice could only nod. "What did he say? What did he say?" cried Lenora. But Janice could not tell anyone. It was much too good to tell. She sat listening to that one word again and again as her memory played it back to her. She sat listening while Lenora took the phone away from her without her knowing it and put it back upon its hook. Then they were in bed and the lights out and the night wind blowing through the rooms, a smell of the long journey in darkness and stars, and their voices talking of tomorrow and the days after tomorrow, which would not be days at all, but day-nights of timeless time. Their voices faded away into sleep or wakeful thinking, and Janice lay alone in her bed. Is this how it was over a century ago? She wondered. when the women the night before lay ready for sleep or not ready in the small towns of the East and heard the sound of horses in the night and the creak of the Conestoga wagons ready to go and the brooding of oxen under the trees and the cry of children already lonely before their time. All the sounds of arrivals and departures into the deep forests and fields, the blacksmiths working in their own red hells through midnight, and the smell of bacons and hams ready for the journeying and the heavy feel of the wagons like ships foundering with goods, with water in the wooden kegs to tilt and slop across prairies, and the chickens hysterical in their slung beneath the wagon crates, and the dogs running out to the wilderness ahead and fearful, running back with a look of empty space in their eyes. Is this then how it was so long ago? On the rim of the precipice, on the edge of the cliff of stars. In their time, the smell of buffalo, and in our time, the smell of the rocket. Is this then how it was? And she decided, as sleep assumed the dreaming for her, that yes, indeed, very much so, irrevocably, this was as it had always been, and would forever continue to be. And that is the end of that story. Let me see. I'm going to at least read this next bit. 2035 to 2036. They came to the strange blue lands and put their names upon the lands. Here was Hinkston Creek and Lustig Corners and Black River and Driscoll Forest and Peregrine Mountain and Wildertown, all the names of people and the things that the people did. Here was the place where Martians killed the first Earthmen, and it was Red Town and had to do with blood. And here where the second expedition was destroyed, and it was named Second Try, and each of the other places where the rocket men had set down their fiery cauldrons to burn the land, the names were left like cinders. And of course there was a Spender Hill and a Nathaniel York Town. The old Martian names were names of water and air and hills. They were the names of snows that emptied south in stone canals to fill the empty seas, and the names of sealed and buried sorcerers and towers and obelisks. And the rockets struck at the names like hammers, breaking away the marble into shale, shattering the crockery milestones that named the old towns, in the rubble of which great pylons were plunged with new names: Iron Town, Steel Town, Aluminum City, Electric Village, Corn Town, Grain Villa, Detroit 2, all the mechanical names and the metal names from Earth. And after the towns were built and named, the graveyards were built and named too. Green Hill, Moss Town, Boot Hill, Bide a Wee, and the first dead went into their graves. But after everything was pinned down and neat and in its place, when everything was safe and certain, when the towns were well enough fixed and the loneliness was at a minimum, then the sophisticates came in from Earth. They came on parties and vacations, on little shopping trips for trinkets and photographs and the, quote, atmosphere. They came to study and apply sociological laws. They came with stars and badges and rules and regulations, bringing some of the red tape that had crawled across Earth like an alien weed and letting it grow on Mars wherever it could take root. They began to plan people's lives and libraries. They began to instruct and push about the very people who had come to Mars to get away from being instructed and ruled and pushed about. And it was inevitable that some of these people pushed back. So that is a precursor to the next story, which is Usher 2. But I'm going to save that one for tomorrow night and give any of you out there a chance who might want to familiarize yourself with the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Fall of the House of Usher, because that is the cornerstone of the next story, which is called Usher 2. But I'm not going to read it tonight. But again, I wanted to go back. I find it very, very interesting that the last story actually makes the dichotomy of what Bradbury's working with even more plain, because on the one hand, that it is, that about people embarking for Mars and going to Mars to make a new life, which is not only obviously, of particular interest to the telling of this story about the human settlement of Mars, but also because it is very much a thing that was part of or still is in some ways, although becoming less so, unfortunately, that was very much part of the mythology, the self-mythology of America. And Ray Bradbury is, if nothing else, a very American writer. And his roots are not just in America, but they're in the American Midwest. So the center of the country, far from the oceans, and also very close in conceptually, if in no other way, to the agrarian roots of America. So not only do you have this idea of the migrants, the emigrants, leaving one place to go to a better, or hopefully better, but also unknown and perhaps frightening because of that, life in a new place. But he also very knowingly and very obvious. So that's the kind of the subconscious thing of how much a part of the American dream, emigrating from the old world to America, to the new world, was as part of the American culture with which Bradbury grew up. But then again, Bradbury himself is quite knowingly and consciously referring to the great westward expansion that was so much a part of what made America what it is. And the Western expansion is not only a thing, a physical thing, but of course, obviously, as Bradbury has done in other cases, it calls back to things like the destruction of the Indian or Native American culture of America, the chicken pox that killed the Martians is very much obviously a citation, or I've just gone blank on my word, but it's an evocation of the smallpox that killed the Native Americans and the other diseases that came in long before the American westward expansion. They had already come into, there was, by the time that the Europeans showed up and had been here for a few years, their diseases had spread all through the continent and grossly reduced the number of native people living here. And that was one of the reasons that it was comparatively so easy to expand for the incoming Europeans, because they'd actually 80% or whatever it was in many places of the native population had died, the indigenous peoples. But also, obviously, Bradbury is citing and evoking the covered wagons, the trail, the Oregon Trail, all of these kinds of things that are also a big part of the American myth. And he is combining them with the idea of traveling out into space. And now, obviously, 80 years on from when these, or 70 years on rather, from when these stories are written, and 80 years in the story from when Bradbury was writing these stories, a lot of things, have changed. The idea that only men would be there for the first few years. We live in a modern world where there would certainly be women as part of the initial travel to outer space by that point, and to colonization, for a number of reasons, but mostly because the world has changed. And the idea of the women folk kind of sitting around at home waiting for the men to make things ready for them, old-fashioned, but also very much part of what Bradbury is talking about, in that he's not talking about Mars per se. Mars is the stage. He is acting out a lot of things that he wants to talk about America and about modern society, But as we will see in the next story, which I'll be reading tomorrow night, he's not just talking about, in a kind of mindlessly pro-American or Western civilization kind of way. He's also talking about the things that go with civilization that are less pleasant. And of course, that is something as a big, as you'll see with Usher too, and I'll talk about tomorrow, a big concern of Bradbury's was the strangulation of the imagination and things like Fahrenheit 451, which for many people, because they read it in school, was his best known work. Big topic of his, and it comes up in a much more kind of amusing and interesting way in the next story, Usher 2. But I will talk about that tomorrow when I read it. Until then, oh, but let me mark my spot there. Until then, I will thank you as always, as I always do, because it's important to me, for joining me. It's a huge pleasure to spend some time with you. I wish I could spend time with you all personally. I wish I could come and read to you at your houses, but I cannot for various logistical reasons. So instead, I'm doing my kind of weird grandfather act on the video, on the video. Until we meet again, whether it be next week or whenever, or if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, again, please help out Chris who puts these up and be a subscriber and drop him some likes. But until that point, I say, please, please, please continue to take good care of yourselves, take good care of your friends and loved ones, help out people who might need, if not a helping hand, just a kind word or a smile. And I will see you all very soon. So one more time, thank you and peace and be well. Ciao.